And good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everybody who joins us live today, and same to the people who are joining us via the on-demand video. I'm Adam, I'm the voice that you've been hearing for the last couple of weeks, and I'm joined here by Rory. We're trying something a little bit different this week, where we're going to give you guys the opportunity to speak to Rory directly. I've still got a bunch of questions to go through that have been submitted on the forum, which is awesome, and there's some great questions. But we are going to give you the chance to speak to Rory directly. So what I'm going to ask you guys to do is, if you want to ask a question or speak to Rory, please use the function to raise your hand. Then what I'll do is I'll let you know when we're about to come to you. We will make you a panelist for the session briefly, and then we will ask you to turn on your audio and video, preferably both, but if you're only comfortable with the audio, that's fine too. But preferably both. We'd like to see some of your lovely faces there. We've already got one hand up, which is awesome. And I hope that's from Lisa, and I hope she's going to speak to Rory about Dan Kahneman, but maybe not, but we'll see. So let's get started, I suppose. Again, thanks for joining us, everybody. We'll start with a question from Susan. Susan works for a not-for-profit professional development association, but they're not tied to a specific profession like accountants or dentists or something like that. And people don't need to belong to associations like this anymore for access to information and group insurance, etc. So how can we approach member acquisition when it's not necessary to join for old reasons?
I suppose what you are facing there is actually a classic free rider problem. And that's actually something, in fairness to economists, I often give economists a very hard time, but it's rather like the point that Jeremy Bullmore made, that it is always possible to walk through a revolving door without giving it a push yourself. Okay? And in the same way, one of the problems with trade associations or any organization which involves some degree of voluntary effort and typically has member fees, is it is dangerously easy to reap the benefits of such an organization without actually shouldering the costs. And so, funnily enough, I was president of the IPA for 2 years, from 2009 to 2011. And it is very interesting because, in many ways, the work that the organization does benefits the whole of the advertising sector, the agency sector, including those agencies which choose not to join. And every now and then you get people who tend to drop out. One of the interesting questions there, I think it's a terrible mistake, by the way, when people do that free rider thing, because I think in many industries, this is why I think trade organizations and what you might call voluntary organizations, which actually get people together in a particular industry. The reason they're really, really important is, in fact, although most of the competition within a business relates to how your business relates to its competitors, most problems in a business, I think, are actually sector specific. I don't think they're actually business specific. And I worry about that with the advertising industry a little bit, because we're always given the brief of solving the world's problems one brand at a time, when quite often what you need is collaborative, cooperative action between many brands to actually solve the problem. Environmentalism would be a classic example. I think in many cases, because budgets tend to reside with individual companies, that limits the ability of collective organizations to act. And as a result, I would say, look, we're trying to save the world one brand at a time, and ultimately we're not going to succeed. And so there is an appropriate scale at which things can be solved. Sometimes it can be solved at a very small scale. Sometimes you need intervention at a collective, collaborative scale. I do think actually with those organizations, what the IPA does very cleverly is they create enough benefits which are exclusively available to members. that actually effectively, so as you can free ride on much of their work, but actually a very useful concept to understand is the distinction between club goods, public goods, private goods, and the fourth one is a commons. And have a look on Wikipedia, by the way, if you just go on Wikipedia, private goods, club goods. What the IPA does is you have, obviously, some of what you do actually benefits everybody, member or not, simply by dint of benefiting the category. But the trick is, I think, to create enough things. And in the case of the IPA, it's quite often training, intellectual property. There are a whole bunch of things. And there's also a kind of status component, which is that undoubtedly quite a lot of collective activity operates on the shame principle, that not being a member of the Institute of Practitioners in Advertising is probably viewed as being faintly shabby. In other words, so it is a really, really important thing. So various things like accreditation training, intellectual property, in some cases databases, to an extent, I think some of these organizations are actually a feature in, for example, procurement. So an agency is asked, which trade bodies do you belong to? And generally belonging to a trade body does signify something in terms of your general commitment to professionalism and the fact that you're committed to the industry, not just to yourself. But it is a tough one because, but designing enough in that people feel FOMO, in other words, loss aversion. If I don't belong to this, I am missing out. And if all the organization does is kind of campaign at the EU level on behalf of agencies, one other thing I think is that new technology like video conferencing, online events, provide quite an easy way of adding communal value at relatively low cost. I don't think we've noticed this, that what we're doing now, okay, had we tried to do it physically, one, you're all on different continents, so it would never have happened. Two, we would have had this dreadful thing of how you had to book a venue and you had to decide how big the venue needed to be and what the catering costs were and all this kind of nonsense. The administrative cost of staging any kind of event, conference or whatever in the physical world is immense. There's also, as was the case, by the way, with the IPA, a huge amount of invisible discrimination. You have a one-day conference in London that costs £300 or £200 to members. That's another thing you do. Now, that costs £200 if you're based in London. If you're based in Edinburgh, attending the same event is going to cost you £600. And, I think one of the interesting things we noticed as a trade body is that a lot of people, I think, resented the fact that it was too London-centric. I think there's a very important distinction you've got to make so that people who live further away from London don't feel they're getting disproportionately bad value.
Yeah, very useful. Very useful.
But talk more, because it's an area that really interests me, because what I learned at the IPA was that actually we spend all our time agonizing about our individual businesses. But when you talk to someone in a related business, they have all the same problems. Realistically, we think they're unique to us. They really aren't.
Yeah, right. And they all come together there. That's good. Right, I'm gonna read a question from Charlie, and then Liesl, we're gonna come to you. So we're gonna make you a panelist now. So if, like I say, if you want to do that, if you want to put your audio and your video on, you can speak to Rory after this. Okay, so this is a quick question from Charlie. From your experience, which industries would benefit the most from behavioral science, and of those industries, which are most overlooking the field?
Well, that's a great question. Generally, first of all, there's an interesting question, which follows on from the previous question, which is it an industry or is it a sector? And the example I'll give there very simply would be, let's look at electric cars, okay? They're all competing on range, and they're making range the distinguishing feature of one model versus another, okay? And that's perfectly sensible. If you're Kia or you're Hyundai and you're competing with Ford, and you're competing with Tesla, and you're competing with Polestar, that seems like a logical thing to do. The consumer tells you, I'm really worried about range. So you say, well, we've got more range than the other guys. Okay. At the individual brand level, that kind of makes sense. At the collective level, what you're doing is you're making massively prominent a negative about the category. It's a bit like if Coke competed with Pepsi by saying contains less cyanide, right? Okay, yeah, okay. You are winning out over Pepsi by claiming that you contain less cyanide than Pepsi, but you're not doing any favors for the category as a whole. All right. And my contention is, by the way, in 12 months' time, as I said, in a country like the UK, not true in the US, Australia, Canada, because they're what geography experts call very, very big. Okay. But in small, densely populated areas like most of the UK, north of Scotland, Wales, outliers, okay, parts of Wales, range isn't going to be a problem. In fact, because of this range anxiety, everybody's buying bigger batteries than they need, which is making the cars more expensive, which is bad for the environment, which is actually compounding the problem. Okay, so it's not always, I don't think, and I'm becoming increasingly conscious about this. I think because budgets for marketing activity and therefore for behavioral science and so forth tend to reside at the individual brand level, that's where we try and solve problems, and not all the problems are there. I think there are problems. Nobody wears hats anymore. Okay, that's not, there is no brand dominant enough in the hat industry who can afford to do category level advertising. But equally, that's medicine is obviously an interesting outlier, because understanding the placebo effect, understanding psychology. Actually, I'll give you a very simple answer for the Brits present. If you are, the NHS could enormously benefit, both in terms of relationships with its own employees, but equally with how you treat patients. In other words, a relatively small investment in behavioral science could transform things like waiting lists, the experience, the efficiency of waiting. I'll give you a little example of this. Now, I'd be really interested if anybody knows an exception to this. When you have a medical appointment, they give you one appointment and they say, yes, your colonoscopy is going to be on May the 24th. Now, if I have a colonoscopy, it's fairly important, okay? And they could actually say to me, your colonoscopy will definitely take place before May the 24th, but we've also booked you a possible appointment on, let's say, April the 23rd. Okay, so can you keep both dates free? Now, I'm a reasonably busy guy, but I can keep 2 days free for an appointment. Mm-hmm. And that would mean that if they get a cancellation, they can bring someone forward. Okay? It's just very interesting to look at things like, in healthcare and realize they really haven't changed much since the 1940s. Nobody even asks, would you be happy to have a colonoscopy at 1 o'clock in the morning? I'm a total night owl. Okay. I'm up at 1 o'clock in the morning anyway. There are things I'd rather be doing than having a colonoscopy at 1 in the morning. But nonetheless, if they actually said, okay, 24 hours notice, be here at 1 o'clock tomorrow morning, I can do that. Nobody ever asks. There's no, the entire appointment setting thing is done basically as if we're 1932. And so the NHS and healthcare in general, and also things like the placebo effect, really, really clever things like how you reduce the risk of antimicrobial resistance in antibiotics. Very, very clever behavioral science idea there, by the way, which is there was this awful divide, which is doctors go, oh God, do I give the person antibiotics? In which case they probably don't bloody need them. They're going to get better anyway. But if I give them antibiotics, at least they'll piss off and they won't come back. Whereas if I don't give them antibiotics, they'll come back 4 days later and go, oh, I'm not feeling much better. Okay. Now they solved that problem by creatively thinking up a third option, which is the post-dated prescription. And they said, look, you'll probably get better anyway. This is, let's assume it's Thursday. They give me a prescription which says, this is a prescription dated for next Tuesday. If you're not feeling better by then, okay, go to the chemists and start taking antibiotics. And it was good advice medically, but it was also brilliant for antimicrobial resistance. And it was also great for patient-doctor relations, because probably 8 times out of 10, the bloody prescription went in the bin, okay? But the person had walked away with a piece of paper, so they didn't feel cheated. And there wasn't a second appointment. Those are the kind of ideas, I think, around behavior where the room for creativity but equally the reason Pete and I wrote a book about transportation is that those things that have been run the same way by the same people for a long, long time often what they've done with technology is they've just paved the cow paths. They've taken what they did in the old world and they've come up with a new world solution to it. In other words, it used to be a form, now it's a web page. They haven't used technology or psychology, or the two in combination, to fundamentally reinvent how the thing works. I actually said, the Department for Transport, I said it would make perfect sense for the Department for Transport to buy Zoom for everybody in the UK. Just pay Zoom something like, 120 million a month. Okay. Zoom will be as happy as Larry. Their stock price will rocket. Okay. For £2 a month, all you've got to do is get everybody in the UK on average to make one less journey, or actually, let's say 3 fewer journeys, and one of which is a peak time journey. Okay. All you've got to do that, and that's the equivalent of spending billions on new roads and rail routes and new rail infrastructure. Okay. But the problem is they're called the Ministry for Transport. Actually, technically, they're called the Department for Transport. They're not called the Department for stopping people from moving about quite so much. And so their whole framework, their mental framework and their metrics and everything else are effectively trapped in a non-behavioral mindset. It's based on people basically travel when they need to travel. Our job is to help them do that. And the question is, well, why don't you, given that most people bloody hate commuting, or at least hate commuting 5 days a week, given that there are a lot of journeys which are actually done to fulfill an obligation, not through actual desire, can we not rethink this a bit?
Yeah, that makes sense. So some good examples there, and I agree with you on the healthcare thing. I think that's prime. So, okay, we are going to take a question from the floor now. So I think we're joined by Liesl. Liesl, if you can unmute yourself and fire away. Is Liesl there?
Yep, she's there. She's pinned. And she's just about to appear, I think.
Hey,
Liesl.
We can hear you, but not see you.
hi. I am. Can you hear me?
Yeah, perfect. Hey, Liesl.
Perfect. We can see you too, both.
I'll go ahead anyway, if that's okay.
Please.
Yeah, go ahead. We can hear you and see you.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. I have a question which is slightly different from what my original question might have been, but it touches upon the whole Kahneman rejecting some of the theory on priming and the hullabaloo on strategy Twitter, which resulted, because I think it's part of a bigger question. And I would very cheekily posit, Rory, that we might have the wrong Sutherland on this call, and that perhaps your wife might be the person we should be asking the question of. The reason being, I imagine that she knows a lot about hermeneutics and theological exegesis, which is where I think we are with behavioural science. Let me ask the question. We talk a lot about how we use behavioural science. People learn a lot from you, Rory, and I know that people constantly say, how do we then take that and put it into practice? And I would posit and ask your opinion on the fact that we're trying to make behavioural economics, behavioural science, research type activities into Albert Einstein and Stephen Hawking, when we should actually be thinking about them more as Alec Ferguson and Connie Mack. We have exploratory activities and preparatory activities, which are then turned into sort of standardised, replicable techniques and laws, and we're perhaps taking that too far in precision, when what we should really be doing is saying that we have a bunch of things, ideas and areas in which really creative and really excellent thinking can happen in marketing, in understanding how people think, feel and why they do things. We're trying to make it too much like Hawking and not enough like Alex Ferguson. What are your views on that?
Yes, I think that's true. My wife certainly knows a lot more about that. Unfortunately, she's out. Otherwise, I might call her to the screen. But she's gone out to host a church service, appropriately enough. But one of the things I'd say is that when people go, "Oh, it doesn't replicate," they tend to assume that means it isn't true. Now, just to be clear, just because some priming experiments, and there were some priming experiments I was myself suspicious of, because I couldn't see the evolutionary advantage to, for example, walking slowly when people talked about old age. And by the way, actually, that replication problem seems to be weirdly common across other sciences as well, including medicine, that you seem to get a very strong result and then subsequent experiments deliver it less and less. Now, a few things. I think priming is at some level true, okay? Now, you know, it's completely nonsensical to say a very, very abstruse and obscure priming experiment, which didn't really make any logical sense, okay, didn't replicate, therefore priming isn't true. And my argument would be, well, one, what do you mean by true? Because in physics, true means true all the time. Physics is the study of immutable laws, whereas what we're studying is contextual laws. And what is undoubtedly true is that sometimes people, I mean, you know, it's, okay, I'll give you an example. You know, if you are, I've occasionally, Nassim Taleb and I are both very sweary speakers, okay? We tend to swear a lot. And on a few occasions, both of us have happened to give a presentation in a church. Now, it's a secular event, but it's in a church building. And both of us joked about the fact that we just noticed afterwards that we didn't swear. You know, normally if it was in a secular, you know, a leisure centre or a theatre, you know, we'd be effing and blinding around the place. You know, his talk in the cathedral in Kilkenny, you know, he said, you know, he suddenly noticed halfway through, he said, I haven't sworn once, have I? Because I'm in a church. You know, we respond to our environment, we respond to our social environment, we respond to our surroundings, we unconsciously respond to all kinds of cues in an environment. And that, the fact that that happens some of the time to some people is inarguably true. Okay, so you might be absolutely right in what you're saying, because we're looking for immutable laws that are always true for all people all the time. And it's a mistake. And of course, business doesn't need, in business, okay, if 30% of people do something 20% of the time, all right, and nobody else knows this, that's enough to build a really successful business on. You know, we don't actually need to know what's true. We need to know what our competitors are wrong about. And if, you know, if all competitors are assuming that soft drinks have to taste great, and Red Bull spots the fact that actually all new drinks will taste kind of horrible to you because we've evolved, as an evolutionary psychologist would say, we've evolved to be uncomfortable with unfamiliar tastes and flavors. And interestingly, there is a lesson here, because nearly every successful new universal drink started off being sold as a medicine. Okay, tea, coffee were sold on medicinal values. Coke and Pepsi were sold as medicinal products. Okay, Pepsi Cola is called Pepsi because it was kind of eupeptic cola. It was designed to aid your digestion, which, by the way, I think it does, incidentally. But it's very interesting that there seems to be an interesting pattern emerging there, which is not a truth, but it's a replicable pattern, which is that, you know, if you want people to try a new flavored thing, it helps to persuade them that it's medicinal, because their appetite for novelty or unusual tastes, when framed as a medicinal product, is much, much less likely to reject something than when something's framed purely as a recreational product. And so I mean, I think you're absolutely right that we're getting ourselves in a bit of a muddle about what a science is. And all it is trying to, there's a wonderful piece I shared on Twitter in the last couple of days by the fantastic physicist, Richard Feynman, where he says, you know, all I'm doing as a scientist is I'm trying to find out more about the world. Now, he says, if it turns out that there's one universal law that governs everything in the world, that's great, okay? But if there isn't, I can still find out a lot more about what's going on. And I mean, the problem behavioral science has is that the appeal of what I call scientism, which is let's pretend it's physics and proceed from there, is because it removes ambiguity, subjectivity, and it simplifies things. And in a business or institutional setting, people really, really love, you know, there are only two things you can do here. They love being told that, because now, you know, it's a straightforward decision. And in some ways, of course, creativity is the enemy of false certainty. It comes in and says, have you thought about it like this? Oh, I see your product's not selling very well. Why don't you make it more expensive? Okay. Now, all of those things can be proven in certain situations to work, but it really messes with people's heads. They don't want to live in a world like that. And actually, it gets worse, because more educated people I met the chap who wrote The Road to Somewhere, David Goodhart, a couple of days ago. And there's a weird problem, which is that more educated people are more likely to be dogmatic and are more eager to look for generalized. To some extent, if you're poor, you can't afford to live your life according to universal principles because you've got to duck and dive, and you can't afford the luxury of a kind of spurious consistency. Okay. But richer educated people actually become more and more dogmatic, and they're less and less willing to listen to contrarian points of view. I mean, weird. Okay, I've just to give a weird example of this. Okay, in the Brexit referendum, I voted Remain. Okay, I thought it was probably a bit disruptive leaving. I could see arguments for leaving, but on the other hand, the reason I almost became basically a leaver after the result was the reaction of highly influential, highly educated Remainers was insane. They couldn't understand that there was an opposing point of view. And they refused to acknowledge that actually it was more complicated than they thought it was. And I thought that was very weird, because you literally had a case where in some ways the most educated people were being the most stupid, because their status derives from an ability to make generalizations. Education selects for the ability to generalize. You won't get a first-class degree at university by going, fall of the Roman Empire, fuck me, a lot of stuff going on, it's really complicated, right? Well, what you're rewarded for is saying, it all started here, and it was all because of this, right? And so, it's fundamentally problematic, I think, in the sense that we're actually educating people into a kind of, dogma and a foolish consistency of thought. And actually, creativity really, really annoys those people. People from poorer backgrounds, relish that kind of, Odyssean cunning, because that's what you need to get by. You need a little bit of the mind of a game theorist, a little bit of the mind of the economist, you need to borrow a mental toolkit from all kinds of places if you're in difficult circumstances or if you're poor. When you get rich, one of the first luxury goods people buy isn't an expensive car, it's a ridiculously narrow point of view. Great guy, by the way, a psychology guy at Cambridge called Rob Henderson, Rob K. Henderson on Twitter. And he coined the phrase in writing in the New York Post, because he's a guy who actually grew up in fair poverty in LA in a series of orphanages. And he coined the phrase luxury beliefs, that certain people are now acquiring sort of belief sets as a kind of, it's the 21st century equivalent of a Louis Vuitton bag, is to have a certain opinion and to hold to it very, very unapologetically. And I mean, that is the problem with selling behavioral science in an institutional setting, is you are going in, and I would say, well, you're expanding the possible creative solution space, but they go, you're complicating things. We know, we can sell more by dropping the price. Well, you can sell more by dropping the price, but it's a really expensive way to do it, right? It is, by definition, the most expensive way of selling more of something you have is effectively to pay people to take it off your hands, right?
Excellent. And that luxury beliefs, I like that. I like that a lot. So that's Rob K. Henderson. Rob K.
Henderson on Twitter, great guy. He's got a newsletter as well. Follow it. Really interesting.
Okay, so we're going to go to a question from Lisa, but then we're going to go to the floor, and we're going to speak to Steve from Trinidad and Tobago, who I think you may know, Rory. So Steve, if you will, make you a panelist, and then if you want to just bring on your audio and your video as well. To the people who may have joined us late, if you want to ask a question and speak to Rory directly, just raise your hand, and we'll try to get to as many as possible. But this is a question from Lisa, and it's a quick question. Has Rory got any examples of price anchoring for real estate?
Okay, if you want to contact me offline, because my dad was in the property business all his life, okay? And I think that the world of advertising and branding, the world of behavioral, I mentioned the NHS earlier as an example of where behavioral science could play a part. I think the property industry is absolutely fascinating in that respect, because it is one really, really. I mean, if you think about it, okay, part of the reason property prices are very high is that people below the age of about 45 can't remember in their adult life interest rates being above about 3 or 4%. Okay. And so one of the things that, worries me is that people have just come to assume that, your mortgage payments might go up by 10 or 20%, but it's not going to be a big deal. And actually, there are a lot of people who could end up underwater. Yeah. So, I mean, that's one case where, and actually we've come to normalize a level of expenditure on housing, which is completely bizarre. I mean, in all of growing up outside London, okay, in a provincial setting in the early 1980s, late 70s, the ratio of property costs to income has just become utterly ridiculous. And actually, of course, I mean, very interesting question, by the way, is why so relatively few people just sell up and leave and stop working? Because there must be a whole generation of people in London who could do that if they wanted to, and yet they don't. It's kind of interesting. But no, framing, that's very, very interesting, which is, well, undoubtedly, I suppose, people do it kind of with the penthouse, don't they, in certain developments. So you make the penthouse £5 million. Whether you actually sell it for that is actually probably a bit moot. But nonetheless, it makes the other apartments at 800,000 seem comparatively a lot cheaper. I always jokingly said that in property you could frame club membership. If you join a club like the RAC club, if you look at it purely on its own merits, okay, joining the RAC club, £2,500 joining fee, £1,000, £1,500 a year membership fee, okay. I always jokingly said, well, it's an unbelievably expensive indulgence until you compare it to the price of maintaining a flat in London, in which case, as one friend of mine who belongs to that club said, it's the check I'm happiest to write all year. Because I write a check for £1,500. I've got a place I can go in London. I can pay a bit extra and stay the night. I've got a swimming pool. I've got a staff of 10. I've got a library. I've got 4 restaurants at my disposal. Okay. Right, for about 5% of the cost of having a crappy 1-bedroom flat in some, converted warehouse. The other great thing with the Oxford and Cambridge Club or the RAC Club is they don't ring you up at 3 o'clock in the morning and say that the immersion tank's burst. So here's my real challenge. I think if someone could create something psychologically which feels like ownership without requiring you to pay the full capital amount up front, but it gave you a sense of ownership that you were invested in something, and that you, I think there's a whole psychological category of property that doesn't exist. So in Germany, for example, people rent for a very long term, and people who rent property will actually install dishwashers, repaint it, redecorate. They'll redecorate rented property. We don't have that. That mentality doesn't exist in the UK at all. The idea that I rent my house, but it's my house, which either you own it or, you're there basically, trying to get the buy-to-let landlord to repair everything. And so I think, I think the scope for behavioural science, by the way, in property, I mean, the one thing I find fascinating psychologically is that there's a huge amount of money you can make basically buying property that has really unattractive furniture and decor, making the furniture and decor attractive and selling it for an insane margin over your time and investment cost. What's going on there? Okay. And the reason is when people now look at property websites, they use the decor as a proxy measure for the kind of person who lives there already. And if it's already tasteful and nice, and blah, 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 they go, nice middle-class person is happy to live there. Therefore, I'm happy to live there. Okay. If you literally, I mean, if you don't want to sell a house, if you put in a stair lift, now you can remove a stair lift in an afternoon, right? If you have a stair lift there, or you have like strange furniture or a walk-in bath, it kills the sale value of a property. Even though the bugger who's going to move there is just going to replace all that stuff anyway. Okay, you actually have the top-end property market in London, where a kitchen installer said the most depressing part of his life is you go and install a £90,000 German kitchen in a flat in Knightsbridge. Okay, and you have to do it immaculately because the purpose is to sell the flat. And then they show a load of people around and they look at the built-out kitchen, and eventually the flat sells for £3.4 million. And the first thing the person does is trash the existing kitchen they've put in 3 weeks ago and replace it with a kitchen that's slightly more to their taste. So the poor kitchen installer says, I'm actually there doing a perfect job of installing a kitchen, knowing full well that in 3 months' time, I'm going to be trashing the thing. I mean, the psychology around property is much, much weirder than I think we've ever acknowledged. And I also think there's a really interesting question, okay? When you mention framing, can you reduce the extent to which location determines the status and value of property? So if you found a way to use design or architecture to build in relatively inexpensive but well-connected areas and created a community that was so cool architecturally that actually, I've got the creative director of the German agency who's now retired. I asked him, where do you live? He's based in Frankfurt. He didn't say, I live in so-and-so, Lebensbüttel or whatever it might be, which is a suburb of Frankfurt. He said, I live in a Huff house. And he answered my question, not locationally, but architecturally. So it's just a really interesting question, because if someone could actually break the stranglehold of location, when you buy a house, do you know, this is the weirdest thing. Most people, when they buy a house, think they're buying a house. They think the £800,000 is actually going to the bloody house. It's not, okay? You can build a really, really nice house for 200 and something thousand, £300,000. What they're paying for is the land plus the planning permission. So people aren't even buying what they think they're buying. That's how weird it is psychologically. But if you want to talk more, anytime, because it fascinates me. Also, I think online property searching is a mess because it only shows people what they think they want. And people actually don't know what they want until they've seen it. So I think online property searching, a good estate agent will always sell you something you didn't know you wanted.
Yeah, right.
And so I think online property search is actually a really dumb thing. I think they should throw in wildcards all the time.
Yeah, very good. Okay, so we're going to go live now to Steve. Steve, if you can put your camera on and unmute yourself, and then fire away.
Hello, good morning. Good morning.
Welcome. Fantastic. Are you in Port of Spain? Is that right?
Yeah.
Fantastic. Welcome.
I live in a garden flat, not in Port of Spain. Anyhow, Rory, I wanted to start this question by recognizing some similarities in some recent books. That's Alchemy, Loon Shots by Sati Bakal, Why Does the Peddler Sing by Paul Fellick.
Oh, well done. That is a fantastic book. Brilliant.
Mind in Motion by Barbara Tversky. And an earlier book by Disney called Imagineer. You would probably understand that I'm coming from a design creative background when I cite these books, because fundamental to all of these texts, all of these books, is the incredibly important idea of creativity to behavioral science and behavioral design. Indeed, students of design can go way back, showing that, say, like the early work of William Morris and Josiah Wedgwood, they were, behavioral designers.
Yeah.
My question to you is,
in brilliant at branding as well.
Absolutely.
Fantastic. Yeah.
Absolutely. Totally.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Wedgwood, Chippendale, all those people were actually, in a sense, the very earliest people to actually understand what a brand meant. Yeah.
Absolutely. My question to you then, Rory, is what can we do? Because I teach, and I teach across a number of institutions. What can we do now so that our young designers would not, can still put creativity at the center of their practice, instead of having to believe, well, gosh, I need to give up all of this and just go on to be some sort of social scientist?
This is really interesting. I mean, I think that it's a kind of three-legged stool. I mean, we would say that our practice doesn't stand unless you have data science and measurement, behavioral science, and creativity as the third leg. And whether you incorporate all those three legs in one person or two people, or whether you have three separate people, if you don't have those people in the same room, you're not playing with a full deck.
Right.
And by the way, I mean, one of the interesting things about behavioral science is it makes you more creative, because it gives you permission to think illogical, counterintuitive thoughts. And sometimes it gives you the ammunition to explain, now, I mean, for example, okay, I'll give you a lovely example of this. I've just given a talk on behavioral science, and some people, I was at a conference for KFC, and some people were talking about, they had a product in South Africa, KFC in South Africa, and it wasn't selling as well as they'd expected, and they were thinking of dropping the price. And I just butted in and said, you should try putting the price up. Okay, now, okay, if you imagine I hadn't just been given the talk on behavioral science, okay, I just butted into that conversation in an independent business context without any introduction of behavioral science, they basically would have thought I was mad, okay? They literally would have just thought this guy's just being rude, he's insane. Well, now, interestingly, now, by the way, just to be clear, I didn't expect it to work. My point was that if it did work, it was a much more valuable discovery than discovering that you could sell more by dropping the price. And I was able to give a theory as to why it might be, okay, which is, bluntly speaking, I think if there are any KFC fans in the room, they'll agree with me, okay? You go to KFC for kind of two reasons, and it's not the same people necessarily always going for the same reasons, but you go for a bargain or you go for a bit of a treat. And I would argue there are certain goods that are priced at the wrong level because they don't qualify as a bargain and they don't qualify as a treat. And this was quite an exotic product. I think it was sold in a kind of cardboard container, not in a bit of wrapped paper. It was a fancy product. And sure enough, they did put the price up and sales did go up. Now, I didn't expect that to happen. I'll be clear about that. I'm not some sort of weird profit guy, right? I just said, look, it's worth trying this because, it's silly to drop the price on the assumption that that's the best thing you can do. And so, another solution would be to keep the price the same, but to give something free away with it. So bundle it with something else. And so I think, to be honest, I think there's that great phrase, isn't there, about people being T-shaped. You have one specialism but you have a whole area of broader knowledge. Now, I sometimes say that actually you want people who are inverted U-shaped. In other words, they have two things they know about quite a lot about, and then they have a wide hinterland of knowledge that goes further afield. Now, the interesting thing there, I think, is that I think that designers don't need to become behavioral scientists because, to be honest, I've spent a lot of time reading behavioral science. The way I solve problems is still, as likely as not, instinctive and creative. And the guy to read there, the guy to introduce them to is this guy, Roger L. Martin, who believes Roger L. Martin is the second most respected business guru in the world. He's the former dean of the Rotman School the business school in Toronto. And he is the great prophet. He's a hugely venerated man. And let me just go and find, he's a great friend of Nafli.
That's a design.
Yeah, exactly. He fundamentally believes that design thinking, he's written a book called The Opposable Mind, 2007, another book called The Design of Business in 2009. And he thinks that design thinking, and by the way, I think design thinking encompasses behavioral science and testing and measurement. I mean, if design was slightly remiss, historically, it probably didn't test enough. There was an element to design which was a bit fascistic, which is we know what good design is, you don't, off you go, live with what we've got, the Le Corbusier model, of I know better than you what makes a great city. But interestingly, Roger L. Martin would effectively thinks that design thinking is the best source of competitive advantage for any business. And so, I would say that, if you're teaching designers, just say this is a really useful weapon to have in your armory. You don't have to redefine yourself. You're still a designer. You're still practicing design thinking, but this will make you better at what you're already doing. Because it's still, what Roger L. Martin's great expertise is around a thing called abductive inference, that actually you cannot make progress based exclusively on what is already known. Every significant innovation requires some leap of the imagination, some hypothesis, which is generated by the imagination. You can't do it with induction and deduction and sequential thinking on its own. So if you don't have that creative capacity within and I'm not going to name them, but they're one or two behavioral science entities which I think try to be too rational. And the truth of the matter is they're deeply limited in what they can do because they need to have 6 peer-reviewed papers, very, very close to the nature of what they're already doing before they're prepared to do anything. And my argument would be, you've got to try more than that. You can't rely on the scientific literature to confine what you test.
Yep. I never thought it could be a paint by numbers thing, you know?
Mm-hmm. I mean, Martin's point, and he relies on a guy called, I think it's Charles Stewart Peirce, who was an American philosopher of the 19th century. I mentioned him, I think, in some of the earlier talks. And he effectively says, no, you cannot function. You cannot function by induction and deduction alone. If you want to do anything new, if you want to make any kind of progress, someone's got to imagine a different future first. One thing that really worries me, if you want me to get really specific, I don't want to talk about Ukraine because it's deeply upsetting, okay? But I don't think anybody's sitting down and saying, let's be imaginative about how we define geography, allegiance, autonomy, statehood. Okay. Now, if you look at the British Commonwealth, right, and you're a perfect example because you're in Trinidad, okay, right? The Commonwealth was in some ways a brilliant face-saving fudge because you gave countries independence, okay, but you maintained a symbolic continuity. The Queen had absolute, with one exception in Australia, where I think the Governor General got rid of the Prime Minister once, okay? But with that exception, okay, the Queen played absolutely no active role in the place, but it was effectively a face-saving thing, which says that notionally your allegiance lies over here, but your freedom to act is entirely yours. Now, actually, I think there's a very good argument for having your national figurehead as an arbitrary figure rather than an elected figure. Look what happens in America, right? You know, when you have an election now, 48% of people think they've lost their country. And so having this symbolic figure who transcends politics in the same way that religious figures used to do, okay, probably caused as many wars as it ended. But the Commonwealth, which is actually quite an interesting entity, I mean, if you gave me a really perfect brief, which would be, actually take the Commonwealth, move the headquarters out of London somewhere else, move it to Ghana or Vancouver or somewhere which isn't even a capital city, and reinvent this thing where, if there's any connection with the monarchy, it's simply that the monarchy might work for the Commonwealth rather than being head of it. I think you could create an extraordinarily collaborative entity. But I don't think anybody, what worries me a little bit about this conflict is anybody saying, well, hold on, there's a psychological, there's a governmental, there's a political aspect to this, there's a territorial aspect to all this. What if we blurred the lines a bit? Is there a solution? And, that's a case where I think someone's assumed that, okay, you have territory, you have allegiance, you have government, you have autonomy, you have alignment, and that all those things must actually coincide. Well, Canadians, I think 60% of Canadians sort of support having a monarchy. It's probably a bit of a helpful fudge because you had a country which was split between French speakers and English speakers. It was a kind of notional kind of Anglo thing at the top, but it didn't really interfere below. Actually, there's a lot. Those fudges aren't, the Spanish monarchy was decisive in moving Spain to democracy after Franco died. Because those weird symbol, if there was still a Tsar of Russia, right, a constitutional Tsar of Russia, that would be an additional piece on the chessboard that you might be able to use to solve a problem. So I know it sounds a bit weird to come to a Zoom conference and be told, bring back the Romanovs. But all I'm saying is there's more than one way of looking at this.
No, I hear you. Thanks very much, Rory. Thanks, Adam.
Thanks, Steve. Thanks for joining us.
Pleasure.
Don't forget, everybody, Rory's got a hard out today at the end of this hour. He's very generous with his time. We've probably
one additional promise, by the way. I'm totally happy to do an extra hour's Q&A on top of what was if you are, because obviously I can't make the promise without Hero Series agreeing. But if there's still a volume of unanswered questions, I'm totally happy to donate another hour, a few weeks later to do this.
Well, what we may do then is extend the fourth and final Q&A. Just to make sure that all questions are covered. We may be able to fit in one or two more, though. I'm going to go to a question here from Arpan. But if anybody wants to put their hand up to ask the final question and come on camera and speak to Rory directly, we encourage you to do that now. But yeah, for now, we'll go to Arpan. Universities and academia, at large is embracing marketing with a passion. What aspects of behavior science and marketing are the most critical for universities?
Oh, this is actually the marketing of universities.
I think so, yeah.
Crikey, yeah. I mean, that's a really interesting question, because you could argue at the top level, if you look at American Ivy League universities, they've actually become luxury goods. Deliberate scarcity. We worked at one point with Louis Vuitton, and one of the marketing challenges they gave us was, we have insane demand for this particular bag. Who do we sell it to? Okay. And I said, well, not really being familiar with the world of French luxury goods. Okay. I said, well, just open another factory and make some more and you'll sell more. No. Yeah. That was absolute anathema. You can't do that, right? Because you have to maintain scarcity and rarity. And I think there's a kind of revolution coming post-COVID in the university sector, which is it's a very, very rigid system. It assumes you've got to be there for 3 years. Now, as an employer, just to give you a tip here, okay, as an employer, we're obviously keen to recruit someone with a behavioral science qualification. We genuinely don't care whether it's a 1-year MPhil, a 3-year degree in psychology, or a 3-year degree in psychology followed by 4 years as a PhD. We don't differentiate at that level. If you've committed a year to studying this stuff, arguably a PhD would be a bit weirdly counterproductive, because I don't want someone who spent 5 years studying loss aversion. It's just too narrow. So, I mean, one really important question here is, obviously, there's something very, very interesting about universities as brands. And this is what makes them a bit like fashion goods. Louis Vuitton isn't cool because I think it's cool. It's cool because I know that lots of other, if you do think it's cool, some people might disagree, okay? But lots and lots of other rich people know that lots and lots of other rich people like them think it's a really cool thing to wear or carry or whatever, okay? Prada, all the same. Okay, so the brands exist entirely as a social space. And when you choose a university, you're not really choosing the university that's best for you. You're choosing the university that other people think is best. And you're choosing a peer group, and you're also choosing by reputation. And what that does is it makes strong university brands, the Harvards, the Yales, the Cambridges, the Oxfords, it makes them ridiculously anti-competitive in a way, because it's very, very difficult to compete where you don't have to change one person's mind. Now, I'll tell you a lovely story about this. The best idea in university marketing I've ever come across. And interestingly, it was a mathematical genius who came up with it. So a guy called Christopher Zeeman, later Sir Christopher Zeeman, he died at about 95 a couple of years ago. He was appointed to the relatively new University of Warwick, and he was told, we want you to launch a faculty of mathematics at the University of Warwick. And he said, I'm only prepared to do that, he said, if in 5 or 10 years' time, people can say a team of mathematicians at Oxford, Cambridge, and Warwick doesn't sound silly in that context, okay? Unless you can utter those 3 universities in the same sentence without it looking like a discrepancy, I'm not happy to do this. And he said, I know how I can do that, and there's only one way you can do it. This is what he did. How do you compete? Well, you don't compete head-on on a broad front. He said, I'm probably, I don't know if he was this immodest, but I'm paraphrasing, right? He didn't actually say this, but he said, I'm basically the best person in the world at matrix topology, which is a narrow field of mathematics, at which he was fantastic. And he said, if I go out and hire a broad faculty of mathematicians, okay, just a totally broad faculty of mathematicians, I'll be able to get the 97th best person in the world at number theory and the 407th best person in the world on, set theory or whatever it may be, right? But if you let me only hire people in the field of matrix topology, we will be the leading worldwide center for this study, because I can't hire the second best person because he's got tenure at Yale, and I can't hire the third best person because he's got tenure at Stanford, but I can hire the 4th, 6th, 8th, 9th, and 10th best people at matrix topology, right? And then he said, after 8 years, we'll have established ourselves as a brilliant mathematics faculty, albeit in a narrow field. And I'll go and hire the best person in the world at number theory, or whatever it might be. And we'll do the whole thing over again. And now what you have at the University of Warwick is basically mathematicians will, the very best mathematicians of a generation will put down Oxford, Cambridge, and Warwick, more or less in any order in terms of where they're applying. And one interesting thing is, if you want to compete, you can, so someone called me up from the second biggest and second most famous Jewish school in New York. And they said, how do we compete with the #1 school? Because everybody wants to get their kids in there. And I said, you can't compete on a broad front, but what you've got to do is get people saying, get people associating you with music or drama or mathematics. Take one field and overinvest in it, and then let the halo effect do the work. So that's one interesting thing about university marketing. The other thing is, undoubtedly, I think what we're doing now, Zoom meetings, the opportunity to reinvent the assumption that you leave school, you take a year, if you're a bit posh, you go on a gap year and bum around Australia or get killed by a serial killer or something, right? Okay, and then you go to university and you do 3 years. I'm only blaming the Aussies. They do tend to take out British tourists. Yeah. Okay. It's the only, but the interesting thing there is, and then you go to university for 3 years. And that can't be the only answer, right? Okay. All I'm saying is that the format, if you can innovate brilliantly in a format, so you can, one thing I would do, okay, if I ran a university, I'd reserve 30% of the places to mature students. I don't mean really old people necessarily, but I'd say a third of places we're going to reserve to people who haven't just come out of school. Okay. And I would create a social norm that it's perfectly acceptable to leave school, go into a job for a few years, decide what you want to specialize in, go to university for a year or two. Maybe it's a maybe it's a part-time university course, get a degree, go back to work. I think the rigidity of the format is ridiculous. And particularly in a world now where we can learn all the time. I mean, I hope you're learning now, right? Okay. I mean, I hope you're learning something. And actually, lifelong learning, I went, there you go, the new book coming out on wasps. Wasps are actually quite nice. We don't realize this. Wasps are kind of stereotyped as the gangsters of the insect world, but they actually perform very important functions in terms of pest control. But, during lockdown, I, at the age of 55, attended a conference in Raleigh, Durham, virtually, okay, in North Carolina at Duke University on insect epidemiology, because it just really interested me. I blocked in my diary. Now, imagine if I'd gone to the Ogilvy finance director and said, can you spare me £4,000, please, to go to this conference on insect epidemiology? I don't think I would have got, oh, certainly, Rory, which class of travel would you like? I don't think that would have been the response. And so if we don't use Zoom to reshape education, we failed, really, really failed. And actually, all you need to teach really is, to be honest, in the modern world, what you really need to teach is, if you can inculcate curiosity in people, a lot of the rest will take care of itself. In a way, we need to teach people to be curious and teach people how to learn. And actually, the provision of the raw materials is going to become easier and easier. The real question is, which is the first major kind of Russell Group university to break ranks and say, we think this is becoming effectively artificial scarcity, luxury good, status good? Is there something we can do to change that? And I think it'll just take one major university. It should be Stanford, shouldn't it, given that it's in Silicon Valley? But there should be one place which goes, look, why the hell would you confine Stanford lectures to 70 people when there are probably 70,000 people who'd watch them?
Yeah. Okay. Right. Well, I'm afraid we've still got quite a few questions left, but as I say,
I can be late for the next meeting by a couple of minutes. So if you, because I'm not the host of it, so if you want to throw me one more, I'll just be
okay. Well, in that case, we might invite Jonathan to ask his question, and I think Jonathan's quite happy to come on and ask directly. We'll just take a second to make Jonathan panelist, and then Jonathan, if you can put on your audio and your video, that would be awesome. Here he comes. Jonathan.
Not the triple jumper, Jonathan Edwards, is it?
That'd be amazing.
Sadly, no. Although I did represent Kingston Borough at triple jump when I was 16, bizarrely. I don't know if that helps. That's
a bit of nominative determinism, I expect. Yeah, fantastic.
So thanks for letting me join. So background, I'm working in mental health for a private mental health provider, but we work for the NHS just as much as private. And the question is really about sort of managing that split. So I'm CMO, but a lot of what we do is service design. And the question is sort of what factors would you build into service design so that while everybody gets the same clinical product, which they do, and bear in mind now it's the sort of since COVID, we're basically 95% online. I'm sitting in some lovely consulting rooms in Wimpole Street, which is just next to Harley Street, which are basically empty most of the time these days. But how would you kind of...
Am I right in saying, because I went to a launch of Julia Hobsbawm's new book, which is called The Nowhere Office. And she said that actually mental health providers had spotted the value of video conferencing and an online provision earlier than almost anybody else. Is that fair? Because I worked with a company called Owl Labs, and they had a very successful trial in the Northwest. You know, if you think about it, those things like AA, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous, could be taken online. I think they need to be part physical, probably, but some components of it could be A, taken online, and B, scaled through network effects. Because, by the way, one thing I buy into completely is this idea that the NHS and the government in general spends too little on mental health compared to physical health, both for economic reasons and for the alleviation of suffering. I've worked with Paul Dolan, he makes the point that mental health conditions are attention-seeking conditions. You can't, if you've got a pain in your leg, well, actually, if you sit down and stay still, you can make it go away. Whereas there are other medical conditions which essentially seek your attention. And Paul Dolan was involved in making that distinction and arguing that we need to spend much more on this. And I totally buy into that absolutely without question. Yeah.
There's so many behavioural issues applying to I think practically everything you say. I think actually that applies to something I'm doing, to be honest with you. And the whole question of what encourages people to seek help. Sort of when a lot of people would rather go to the doctor, they don't go to therapy. There's a crazy epidemic of people being prescribed antidepressant drugs, for example. And how do you kind of shift the behaviour to get people to seek therapy, for example, or seek help at the appropriate time, which many don't. But my question, which you might see written as well, was about how do you retain a sort of value-add premium proposition in the private world, where we're sort of also offering effectively the same clinical proposition to the NHS, and bearing in mind most of it's online these days. And of course, there's a real, and if you're not in the UK, it might be tricky to understand the dynamics, but a lot of private patients actually are people who would go on the NHS, but because of the waiting list, they then choose to go private. So there's almost a double compromise before they've started, that they think they shouldn't be happy to do it, but they do, versus somebody who's happy to go private or is just being paid for by their private medical insurance. So there's a lot of different...
Very interesting psychological question, which is, by the way, does it work better if you pay for it or if you don't? We have very, very interesting thing to look at. You see what I mean? Because there may be something very strange going on there. By the way, I'm also very interested. I've got a colleague, Tara Austin, who you must speak to, who's very interested in the prospect of psychedelics and some other what were thought to be recreational drugs having a real value in the treatment of depression.
Yeah.
And it occurs to me that, I mean, this, for God's sake, I'm not qualified in this area at all, so I'm talking bullshit, quite likely. But it did occur to me that that certain party drugs, what's depressing about depression is you think it's inescapable. And if something teaches you that actually you can alleviate this, albeit for a couple of hours, then that feeling of being trapped is possibly, it's highly dangerous, it has to be done under controlled conditions, etc. But there is something really interesting there. I mean, I think we're starting to innovate in this area for the first time in ages. But no, very interesting. Don't worry too much about the fact that when you provide something privately, okay, most of it is the same as what you provide for free, because that's true of facing. Bluntly speaking, rich people care more about signaling and fancy things, and poorer people care more about just utility. So if you take, for example, the basic model of, let's say, a Ford or General Motors car, and then you take the top of the range model, 90% of the components in the top of the range model are identical. I'm sorry, my doorbell's just gone. I'll be back in a second.
Jonathan.
Was that interesting, was it?
Jonathan, Rory will be, he has a habit of doing this. It's usually the postman. He's always back very, very quickly. Here he comes.
So there you go. So high status people care more about what things look like. And, you know, and so private medicine is pretty much like NHS medicine, with better sofas and up-to-date copies of Country Life, except the magazines have all been taken away because of COVID, but you get my point. You know what I mean? That actually, and also it's a bit faster, and it probably accommodates your timescales better. But the actual treatment is pretty much, I hope, it's pretty much the same.
Yeah.
Things might be a bit shinier. And to be honest, I mean, most market categories are like that. And the way in behavioral science, you've seen this with software, okay? You see software and it says basic package, tick, 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 X, 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 right? Premium package, tick, 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 X, X, X. Super premium package, tick, 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 right? Now, that is actually a very cunning piece of marketing, because, of course, they've only shown you 3 of the aspects of the basic package. Okay, so you feel you're getting twice as many ticks when you pay for the premium package, and 3 times as many ticks if you pay for the super premium package. Now, let's look at that with just, I know it sounds a bit crass to compare mental health treatment to car salesmanship, but with a car, what they'll do is they'll say, seating, you'll have this list: adaptive cruise control, panoramic moonroof. What they don't do is have a massive list of the ticks that are present in the basic model. They don't say, wheels, differential, drive shaft, right? They don't make a long list of the things that are common to all 3 variants, and then have a few extra ticks to do with the adaptive cruise control, the heated steering wheel, and the moonroof. They take about 3 basic things that are common to all 3, and then they basically play the ratios. But actually, in truth, the basic model, I think, let me get this right, the top of the range model in a car will typically cost about 20% more to manufacture than the basic model, but it sells for twice the price. One of the problems with things like energy, by the way, is it's equally expensive for everybody. So one of the problems with raising energy prices is, to be honest, people like me, I often think I don't pay enough for my electricity. To be honest, I should be paying a bit more, because, if you're above median income, or, and you have quite a lot of discretionary, what I spend on electricity, given the value I get from it, is absolutely tiny. Okay. But equally, you pay the same amount per kilowatt hour. Quite a lot of redistribution of wealth actually happens through voluntary means. It's because companies make quite a lot of extra money from rich customers by selling them vanity components rather than essential components. The nutritional value of sourdough olive focaccia bread isn't really that much higher, than the nutritional value of bread. And so what you're doing when you sell to rich people is you're selling more things. The basic product can be remarkably similar. It's the kind of bells and whistles that you make your money on.
Jonathan, did we get to your question then at all? Or it was
some of it, yeah. One of the challenges I have is that we're not necessarily selling to richer people, actually, because of the dynamics of the UK. Is that, you know, people it's not a kind of an autism assessment for your kid isn't a luxury purchase, shall we say? It's something you're doing out of necessity, but kind of you're being forced to pay for it.
I completely buy that. Actually, funnily enough, I've got a colleague who's had exactly that situation exactly at the moment. Do you want to take this? If you want to email me, and I'd love to take this online and have a really good discussion about it, because I think it is, you're right, it's a really, really important question. And sometimes I think there's also a weird thing, which is status relations, which is the reason people go private is they want to feel like a customer, not like a supplicant. And I think, you know, there is that slight feeling. One of the things I've recommended to the NHS a bit is build in placebo choice to make people feel better. So totally trivial things like, would you prefer an appointment on a Wednesday or a Thursday? Okay. If it's immaterial to you, it makes the person feel a lot better if they're allowed to make gratuitous choices, because it gives them a feeling of being in control. Whereas one of the things, you know, if you think about it, we're used to a world where you can ring up Domino's and you can specify to an incredible level of detail what your pizza looks like and where it's delivered and at what time. Okay. And then suddenly you deal with government and it says it works like this. And if you don't like it, you can lump it. And undoubtedly, you know, nobody ever talks about this, but the extent to which expectations of service and accommodation have changed, you know. My grandfather was an NHS doctor in the 1950s. And of course, you know, the very fact that you were getting medical attention for free was a miracle in itself, you know, and, you know, people were intensely grateful for the whole thing. So that's that, you know, and now, of course, we, you know, unfortunately, you know, at some level, government organizations have to realize that people are comparing them often, I think, unrealistically to what, you know, the level of kind of attention you get paid elsewhere. But no, I'd love to take this offline, because I think it's a really brilliant, and by the way, there's probably no more important application of behavioral science than this, and actually an application of technology too, in the sense that if you can scale this, if you can scale it, there may also be even more an element where people prefer it this way. Because I said, you know, everybody defaults to the idea that Zoom isn't as good as face-to-face, but I jokingly said to my, you know, about my financial advisor, the Zoom relationship with a financial advisor is the perfect relationship, right? I don't want it to be purely textual, but equally, I don't want him turning up at my house where I've got to leave work at 3 o'clock and then go and dig into a load of filing cabinets and make coffee and buy biscuits. You know, somewhere in between the two may be a happy place for a lot of people.
The clinical research from the US is that there's no noticeable impact on outcomes for online kind of mental health rather than face-to-face on average, which means for some people it's slightly better, for some people it's not as good, but on average, actually, there's no discernible outcome. So because in the US, because of the distances involved, actually they sort of pioneered it much earlier.
That's also true, funny enough, for financial advisors, because the financial advisors said previously I was basically limited in people that, you know, half a day's drive away. Yeah,
and you get a mix. Some, because of the nature of mental health, some people want to park it in the middle of the day. They don't want anyone to know about it. You know, other people, if it's taking your kids, they want to have face-to-face because, you know, they just feel that, and sometimes clinically you have to. So it's not quite as simple as that. But
there is an interesting thing about government, which is because government comes from a historical place where it solves the problem for the average. And in some ways, there's Tony Blair spotted this, okay, which is he spotted the fact that there was a kind of thing about the NHS, which is you decided what was best for people on average. And because you had to be fair, you then gave that to everybody. But of course, if people have different tastes, that isn't actually fair, because you're giving something which is very well suited to some people and very badly suited to others. And so, you know, one of the questions I always ask public bodies is, have you actually thought of asking people which they prefer? You know, I mean, you know, it's not, are they going to, because the civil service mentality is sometimes, no, it's my job to work out what is best. And then that goes. And actually, you know, as car manufacturers have discovered, some people want a cheap car that gets them from A to B. Some people want to show off, you know. I'd better go now because I had a panic phone call back there. I'd love to discuss this more because I think it's actually potential for a step change. I think, isn't it? It has the potential for something really significant.
Yeah, totally agree. You get quite excited once you start thinking through the possibilities, to be honest. So,
Jonathan, we'll share your details if that's okay with Rory, so maybe he can be in touch on that. And I want to thank everybody that's joined us this evening, this morning, this afternoon, wherever you are in the world, and we really have been all over the world today. Obviously, thanking especially Jonathan and Liesl and Steve for coming on and speaking to Rory directly, and as always, incredibly generous with his time and a fantastic session. I'm sure you'll all agree. Thank you, Rory. And I'll be opening for questions week 4. It might be an extended session, so get on.
Let's try and book that in. That'd be fantastic if possible.
And that will be a really, really useful session. So thank you all for joining us.